Brad Brisco is with us today. Brad had agreed to come over and be a part of our District Advance, which is our annual mission conference that we hold and annual celebration. And the theme this year was this theme of waymaking in wilderness seasons and what's it look like to make a way during challenging seasons. The story that's been in my mind is from a book that has really influenced me lately called Canoeing the Mountains. Many of you have probably read Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger. In it, he talks about the need for the church to practice adaptive leadership, that we've got to burn some canoes in order to cross the territory we're needing to move into and maybe build some new canoes on the other side. I think Brad is a missiologist of the first order who is thinking about how the church can do that and adapt well to our missional reality that we're finding ourselves in. And he was going to be a speaker, but we had to cancel. But he was willing enough to join us today for a video conversation. And so, Brad, excited to have you with us as we talk about some of the adaptations that are presenting themselves as needing to be made by the church in North America right now. Would love to have you share with us a little bit about some of the adaptations you see coming for the church that we need to be living into. And one of the other priorities that I wanted to focus on is the importance of co-vocational ministry and empowering apostolic lay leaders in the church. I don't like the clergy laity divide. The Church of the Nazarene in our early days were at our best, I think, when we emphasized the priesthood of all believers and we empowered lay leaders for starting new works. And so I would like to talk about that a little bit today. How do we empower co-vocational ministers and new works? So, Brad, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you share with us a little bit today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, you bet, Dale. Well, it's good to be with all of you. Yeah, let me just frame a couple of things and then we can kind of dialogue about it, kind of go whatever direction you'd like to go. So just give you a very brief little my background. So for 20 years, I've worked for what's called the North American Mission Board. 17 of those years, it was what we call a CPC, which stands for Church Planting Catalyst, which just simply means I help to recruit, train, resource, and coach church planters. I was a church planter myself, but then for 17 years, I've just worked really with hundreds of church planters kind of across North America. But then 3 years ago, I took a new role with the North American Mission Board that's just called Director of Bivocational Church Planting. So we'll hit a little bit of that because we can come and talk about what's co-vocational and how's that different than bivo and all of that. So, and then also just some other work that I've done the last 10 years on a strictly volunteer basis. I've worked for another organization called Forge America. So Forge is a mission training agency that was started about 30 years ago in Australia by Alan and Deb Hirsch and Mike Frost. And then about 10 years ago, there was a group of people that started Forge America, which is really, again, just kind of a mission training agency here in the States that around what we call missionary formation. So it's just helping every believer think and act like a missionary where they live, work, and play. So as a result of that, I've done a lot of work the last decade with existing congregations, just helping them kind of just navigate and kind of sort through what does it look like to activate all the people of God into mission. So, you know, just a couple of thoughts about the whole kind of COVID crisis. I mean, first for me, I think it's helpful to recognize that all of us, most church leaders, are kind of going through a couple of phases. I mean, I think the first several weeks, I think it's helpful to just think about it as like almost like an emergency phase where we're just trying to care for people and kind of stabilize things. I mean, that first few weeks are, you know, trying to figure out how to do online services and giving. And so, you know, all of that is legit, right? And absolutely necessary. But I do think at some point, if we're going to think apostolically, there's at some point we begin to shift out of an emergency phase into an adaptive phase. So I've just had dozens and dozens and dozens of conversations with church leaders the last month, kind of about what does that adaptive phase look like. And just as I process that and process it with lots of conversations, I kind of landed on 4 words. And let me just use these 4 words to kind of frame a few thoughts and then let's dialogue about it. But let me tell you what the 4 words are first, and then let me just tell you what I think, the way I think about these 4 words. So the first 4 words are simplification. The second one is decentralization. The third one is repurpose. And the fourth one is just bivocational, or as Dale used the word, co-vocational. So here's what I mean by those 4 words. simplification, this is super simple, but I just think we have to come to terms with the financial structure for most churches has changed, and it's going to continue to change. Part of it is because most churches, their primary mechanism for giving was a Sunday morning worship service, but also just the reality that so many of the people in our churches have lost their jobs that the church is just going to take a hit financially. And I know I've talked to a few church leaders where that hasn't happened, and praise God, but the vast majority of churches, the giving has gone down. So what I mean by simplification, I think, is when we step into this adaptive phase, we're just going to have a process to determine what's essential and what's not essential, like what stays and what goes. Because I think it's fair to say many churches, a lot of programs and activities we provide are what you might call add-ons, and they're just not absolutely essential to the mission of the church. So I think part of what we may need to do is actually recognize or hone in on what is our organizing principle for the church. And then we have to determine the programs and activities, do they connect with that organizing principle or not? Now, my personal bias, I would say the organizing principle of a local church ought to be mission. It ought to be the mission of God. So if you have a program or activity that you can't connect to the mission of God or God's redemptive purposes, then we probably should stop doing that. But you have to decide that for yourself, right? But I just think we're going to have to simplify. We're just going to have to decide what's essential and what's not essential. The second word is decentralization. So there's a couple of things I mean by this. I actually think coming out of this, we're going to see, this won't be enormous, but I think we're going to see more and more networks, what I would call decentralized networks. And those decentralized networks are going to be networks, and I don't care what you call them, they're going to be networks of smaller expressions of church. They're going to be networks of small groups or house churches or missional communities or micro churches. I don't care what language you use. But that's really, as I was telling Dale, that's the primary reason we moved to where we moved, is I wanted to be closer to the Tampa Underground. And the Underground for me is probably the best example in the United States of a decentralized network of smaller expressions of church. But the thing, if you're familiar, the thing that Francis Chan is doing is called We Are the Church out in the Bay Area. There's a big network of house churches. I mean, like 70 or 80 house churches in the Houston area called the Church Project. There's just going to be more and more of those. There's going to be more and more of these decentralized networks. Rather than centralized, they're going to be decentralized. But the other piece of that, I think, is I think we're going to have more and more existing congregations that are going to start asking the question of how can they become somewhat more decentralized. See, I think one of the things COVID has revealed about the church is just how drastically centralized our ecclesiology is. I mean, I think we all knew or know that we put a lot of our eggs in the Sunday morning worship basket, but I've talked to lots of church leaders that said, look, I knew it was a big deal, but I had no idea it was as big of a deal as it turned out to be. So in other words, their staffing, all their programs and activities, everything in some way was connected to the Sunday worship gathering. So I'm not anti-gathering whatsoever, but I think we're gonna have to start thinking about what are those things that are best to be centralized and what are those things that are best to be decentralized. And I just think we're gonna have more and more churches are gonna have those conversations, which I think are very helpful missiologically, but also financially. I just think we're gonna have really good conversations about what sorts of things do we need to kind of push outside the walls of the church. So simplification, decentralization, the third word was repurposed. There's a couple of things I mean by this. I think, first off, if we really do have churches that are becoming more decentralized, we're going to repurpose our buildings to support those smaller expressions of church outside the walls of the church. So we're going to repurpose our buildings to become more of a hub that will be a resource to equip the smaller expressions of church. But another way to think about repurposing, and this is simple, I think, or it's not complicated, is I think we're going to have more and more churches that understand financially they need to repurpose their church buildings as an income stream. And I think we need to get over the myth that that's not okay. So if you have any interest in that, I'll tell you a good book that's come out just a few months ago by a guy named Mark DeMoss. It's called The Coming Revolution in Church Economics. And Mark does a great job of helping us kind of overcome the barrier of thinking that the church can't also have like a side hustle or a side business. So his point is, look, if we can do something for the sake of the city or for the betterment of the city, why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we repurpose part of our building for an income source, but also be a blessing to the city? And I think there's ways that we can do that. So I just think there's things that we can do that we're going to be forced to repurpose our buildings, because I think we're already getting to the point to where we need to realize that we may not always be able to like operate the church on tithes and offerings. So are there some other revenue stream sort of thing? And again, just not go into business for profit, but are there kingdom ventures that would be a blessing to the city that would help our building be like budget neutral? And then the fourth word was bivocation. So again, I just think this is a no-brainer that as a result of COVID, we're going to have more and more church leaders that out of necessity, they're going to have to get a part-time job. And most of them that do that, they're going to feel like it's a demotion. And I don't want them to feel that way. I actually think bivocational and co-vocational church planting, I actually think it is the best missiological and financial strategy for church planting. It just gives there are so many amazing missiological benefits, but there are also lots of wonderful financial benefits to do church planting as a bivocational pastor. So before we just do a little Q&A, let me just help. If you haven't ever heard that word co-vocation, so let me frame that just a little bit. So I actually think the word bivocation sometimes gets in the way of what we want to see accomplished. And here's what I mean by it. Have you ever heard the word to bifurcate? To bifurcate means to take one thing and divide it into two parts. Well, I think unfortunately sometimes when we use the language of bivocational, we do just that. We bifurcate callings. So we have too many pastors or church planters that in their mind, they think like this. They say, hey, I do my work over here, so I can do ministry over here. Well, they're compartmentalizing or bifurcating these callings. And not only, I don't think that's helpful, but I don't think it's biblical. Not only do we need to blow up the clergy laity divide, we need to blow up the sacred secular divide, where like some callings are more sacred than other callings. I don't think that's helpful, and I don't think it's biblical. So a couple of years ago, we started using this language of co-vocation. So think about that word. Co-vocation, the prefix co, C-O, comes from the prefix com, C-O-M, which means to have in common. So think of words like co-labor, co-author, co-pilot. It's about aligning two things together. So I still use both the language of bivocational and co-vocational, but here's my little nuance, and you can tell me if this is helpful to you or not. But for me, a bivocational planter is someone that has a part-time job in the marketplace that they see as temporary. And their hope is that eventually the church will grow to a point to where they can leave their part-time job and focus full-time on the church. Well, I would say, look, thumbs up, right? Nothing wrong with that. But I think if we're really going to ever see a true church planting movement, we can't do it with fully funded planters. We have to do it with bivocational and what I would call co-vocational church planters. So a co-vocational church planter is someone that has a primary calling in the marketplace that they never intend to leave. In other words, they know God's called and wired them to be a fireman or a police officer or a research designer or an anesthesiologist, which is a true example of a guy in the Bay Area. There's another guy who's a CIA federal agent in the DC area, a baker, a business owner. I mean, you could just name it. Any kind of calling you can think of in the marketplace, I bet I could tell you a church planter that is starting something while they're doing that in the marketplace. So a co-vocational planter is someone that has a primary calling in the marketplace they never intend to leave, but at the same time, they feel like God's called them to start something. So here's my hope. My hope is as we champion the benefits of being bivocational, and again, I think there's lots of missiological benefits and financial benefits, but as we champion the benefits of being bivo, and as we champion the bivo planters themselves, in other words, we tell their stories over and over again and say, look, this isn't just necessary, this is legit. I mean, this isn't just legit, it's necessary. That what will happen is we'll actually have more and more bivo planters that become, in a sense, covo planters. So what I mean by that is even when the church gets big enough to support them full time, they just see there's too many benefits of being in the marketplace, so they stay. So even though they could leave and be fully funded, they stay and be BIVO. And I've over the last couple of years, I've seen dozens and dozens of examples of this where a bivocational planter will stay, and instead of them being full time, they'll hire another 1 or 2 or 3 bivocational staff people. So all their staff are either bivocational or co-vocational. So I just think that's a reality. It's an increasing reality for the future of church planting and pastoring. And I don't want bivocational planters to feel like they're second class. I want them, I mean, really, in a sense, they need to become our new heroes. But then here's the other thing is if you are working 30, 40, 50 hours a week in the marketplace, you can't plant a church like we've always planted churches. You can't plant a church with a big Sunday-centric, attractional model. So we need to give church planters kind of a new vision or imagination for church planting. So here's the last thing I'll say, and then we can do Q&A. Here's a simple little way that I'll frame that is I'll say, look, today we need to help our church planters think less like pastors starting a worship service and more like missionaries engaging a context. So in other words, they need to start with missionary behaviors and activities, have a much longer runway to get to the Sunday gathering. So we'll certainly gather. I just tell planters all the time, look, in an increasing missionary context, you just need to be careful not to start with the gathering. So that's probably enough to make someone mad or, I don't know, any questions processing any of that? What thoughts? Just maybe either just about any of those 4 points, perhaps simplification, decentralization, repurposing, and bivo-covo.
I have a question. We have some undeveloped property, and it's really valuable. Our county right now is getting ready to purchase some of it off the front of our property. But we have a real estate developer that recently has joined our church and has talked to us about the possibility of developing a portion of that property commercially and creating a revenue stream that would take care of, would essentially take care of the ministry of the, take care of our current ministry budget. What do you think about something like that?
Yeah, I think it's fabulous. I mean, I think it's fabulous that you're having the conversation. Does it turn out to be fabulous? I don't know. But to have somebody, I just wouldn't hesitate. Talk to business people, talk to city organizer type of people, and find what are the needs in the city, what sort of things. Yeah, how could you leverage that property, again, to be a blessing to the city, but to be a revenue stream at the same time? I just think, yeah, I love it. I mean, and, when I think even of church planting, there just very briefly, I talked about 2 streams, bivocational and co-vocational. But for me, there's actually a 3rd stream. And this isn't as big as bivo-covo, but I might get more excited about this 3rd stream even than bivo-covo. And it's what I would just call marketplace ventures, or it's entrepreneurial church planting, or it's social entrepreneurism, or instead of church as mission, business as mission, it's business for mission. And what I mean by it is it's church planters that are starting businesses and planting churches out of it. So, there are dozens and dozens of coffee shops that are started by church planters. So instead of starting a Sunday morning worship service, they started a coffee shop. There's coffee roasters. A really good friend, one of the best examples of this is a guy in Portland. His name's Anton Farrow. And a couple of years ago, he started a CrossFit gym, and he's planting a church at the same time. He's just killing it on both levels. And so he's never had funding for the church plant because of the business. It's just fantastic. There's businesses that are doing co-working spaces. So yeah, there's just different ways you could do that. And I would recommend, if you haven't heard of it before, go check out Mark DeBoss's book. And he'll just give you a little different imagination for the possibilities. And his church in Little Rock, they've done this. They've used, started businesses, they've repurposed their building. So yeah, I just think to have the imagination of what might you do with that space could just be phenomenal. I mean, it could be commercial space. Who knows? Maybe it's even residential, and there's things you do with houses. I mean, I don't know. I love it. I just love the possibilities, I guess.
What's the name of that book again?
It's called The Coming Revolution in Church Economics. And yeah, I think it was out about 6 months ago. And then also the other thing you might do is you just Google his name. There's a couple of really good podcasts I've watched recently. They're both, well, one's an audio podcast, one's a video podcast. It was just an interview with Mark about the book. So his name is Mark Deymaz, and I think his last name is spelled Deymaz. But that might be a good place to start, is just go listen to one of those podcasts too. And it'll crack open your imagination for sure.
I have a question. I'm Dennis Jones of Union Park Church of the Nazarene, Orlando. Right now I am bivocational. I'm a school teacher, and I'm senior pastor. Now I will be retiring from the school system in October. How can I move how can I effectively move emerge from being bivocational to co-vocational?
Well, but you said you're going to retire from
the school system in October.
Well, do you feel like when you retire from there, is there another kind of calling in the marketplace that you want to consider?
Well, yes, a couple of years ago, I did my master's degree in counseling, mental health counseling. And that would be one of the avenues I'd be also pursuing along with the work in the pastorate.
Well, I would say in my little kind of nuanced definition there, I would say you probably are co-vocational,
Okay.
because, I mean, the work that you do in the school district, how long have you done that?
Let me hear the question again, please.
Well, what you're about to retire from.
I was physical education teacher, as well as the one of the in-school suspension counselors.
Okay, so how long did you do that?
I was with the school system for 26 years.
Okay, so see, I'd say you're co-vocational.
Well, the thing is, I may add that a lot of especially the young adults who attend my church now, they had been my students in school or athletes.
Yeah, so see that right there, that's a great example of the missiological benefits of being in the marketplace, is that you had relationships with people in the marketplace that if you were full-time at the church, and again, this isn't an either or, right? This is both and. There's nothing wrong with being fully funded, nothing wrong. But I would just argue in an increasing missionary context in which all of us live, we have to connect with people outside our church programs and activities. So that's a perfect example. You have relational connections that you would never have otherwise.
That's right.
I would just say, if you're going to retire from that, I would just be thinking, well, what would it look like? I mean, what's that next venture for you to where, and it doesn't have to be full-time in the marketplace, but what's that other thing that you're going to do in the marketplace that gives you some financial stability, but it also gives you relational connections that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Right.
And, and I wouldn't get, I didn't hear you saying this, but I wouldn't get too hung up on the language of bivo versus covo. But the reason I think the language is helpful is that most bivo, they see that as a part-time job, where if we're going to activate a whole army of people, we need to help people see that regardless of what God's called them to do in the marketplace. I mean, if it's a school teacher, or if it's a business person, or a police officer, they can plan a church while they're a full-time police officer. I just want to help them think differently about church planting.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
That's a great example.
Yes, thank you.
I'm curious, Brad. So what are a couple of examples of people who have planted churches in that co-vocational kind of approach? What has that looked like? What might that look like? I mean, you mentioned anesthesiologist. Obviously, we're not starting with the weekend service. We're starting with relationship and some kind of disciple-making environment. What might that look like so it feels manageable?
Yeah, so a couple of things I would say. First off is I'm real careful not to use, and you didn't, but I just say this, I'm real careful not to use the word model, because sometimes when you talk about, BIVO as a church planting model, people think small and they think, oh, well, if you're bivocational, it must be a house church. So instead, I talk about it as a strategy. It doesn't matter what your model is. You can plan a church strategically as a BIVO COVO planter, and it doesn't matter what your model is. So I'll give you an example. There's a guy, I love him. His name is Derek Miller in San Diego. He's a fireman. He's been at this church as the primary leader of this church for 6 years, and he's always been a fireman. And it's a church that runs about 350. So it's a pretty, decent size, very attractional, but they're trying to shift, especially in the midst of COVID. They're trying to shift to become, they were very, very, very centralized. They're trying to become more decentralized. But that's an example. It's not a model, because they, their first few years of the life of the church, they were very centralized. They were very Sunday centric. They were very much of an attractional church. They didn't do a lot of kind of missional, incarnational stuff outside the church. So it, and then again, I could, from police officer to fireman to highway patrol to research scientists. I mean, there really is a CIA federal agent in DC that planted a church about 6 years ago. It's a church that runs about 300, I think, between 300 and 400. And then like the underground here right now, it's a network of about 180 micro churches. All of those micro churches, some that are as small as 12, some as large as 100, all of those micro churches are run by bivocational, co-vocational leaders. No one is fully funded. So just, I mean, the kind of like the sky's the limit as far as what the expression of church looks like. There was something else I was but here's the key, I think. I think anytime we plant churches, we need to do it with a team, but it's absolutely vital, crucial, couldn't be more important that you have to plant with a team if you're BIVO COVO. And the reality is, everyone knows it. I mean, if you're really bivocational or even co-vocational, everyone knows you have a job in the marketplace, that you're working 30, 40, 50 hours a week in the marketplace. So it's like this CIA federal agent. So I've done, over this last year, I've done a lot of phone interviews with co-vocational planters, and I have 9 questions I like to ask them. Well, 2 of the questions are, what are the 2 greatest benefits of being co-vocational, and what are the 2 greatest challenges? Well, number 1 benefit every single time, bar none, was the missiological benefits. It was just what he mentioned about having relational connections. You have access to a mission field you wouldn't have otherwise. But what was fascinating with Hickson, his name's James Hickson, with James is his second benefit. Well, actually, his second benefit was financial. He just says, look, we give more money to church planting because the church doesn't pay me anything. And he said, if I didn't have this other gig, he said, we just wouldn't give as much to mission as we do. But his third benefit that he brought up was that he never has to ask people to step up, because everyone in his congregation knows he's a federal CIA federal agent, and they know he works his tail off. They know sometimes he works 60 or 70 hours a week. So he said he never has to say, hey, would you step up and do such and such? It's just like everybody knows James does this, so we're going to have to do this. So does that make sense? So there's just great benefits, I think. But I think the only way you pull it off, if you're bivocational or co-vocational, is you have to do it with the team. There has to be. So again, it goes back to blowing up the clergy laity divide, right? Instead of having 5% that does all the ministry, and 90 or 95% of people are passive. It's like, no, we have to activate all the people of God. Jokingly, I'll say and actually it probably isn't a joke, but I think the clergy laity divide is of the devil. It's like, if you were the devil and you wanted to short circuit the body of Christ, the best way to do it is convince people there's this chasm between the clergy and the laity. It's just been the most devastating, and continues to be the most devastating barrier in us really just engaging in God's mission more fully. So
what are the supports that a co-vocational planter or pastor needs to be successful? So I think of a decentralized network. There are supports that are provided in that network. What are the supports that are needed for that?
That's a great question. I would say I'd say first off, denominationally, any of us that are in denominational life, we have to champion the stories of the Bivo Covo. So we have to do it to be an encouragement to them, because again, there's just too many bivocational, co-vocational planters. They hear these little whispers, and sometimes it's in their own minds, but they hear these little whispers that they're not legitimate. You know, it's like, when are you going to get a full-time gig, or when are you going to go to church that's big enough to support you full-time? You know, we have to champion the benefits of being bivocational, and then we have to tell their stories. And I say all the time, we need to tell their stories to be an encouragement to the Bivo planter, but we need to tell their stories to crack open the imagination of other people, because there'll be someone else that'll say, hey, I'm a school teacher, I didn't even know it was an option. You mean I can plant a church also? Because they've never heard that before. And then we need to create opportunities to give them a platform for other people to hear from them. Because most all denominational conferences and trainings, you know, they're done by the person that, you know, their church grew 1,000 in 1 year or whatever it might be. So I just think we can do a better job of just supporting and encouraging bivocational, co-vocational planters. But then I would say there probably are other things, like any training that we do. I think the content of the training probably needs to be different than most church planting training. Because we have a longer runway. It's not about fundraising. It's not about getting to a certain point quick enough before the funding, you know, runs out. So I think there's more kind of missionary behaviors and activity training so the content's different, but then the delivery has to be different. We can't do training, you know, on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. We need to do training in the evening. We need to do training on the weekends. We need to do training that's online and it's delivered online. And then lastly, I would say, if we really begin denominationally, we really begin to think of ourselves more as a hub, we'll find out what is it that they need so they can focus on the mission. What can we do to help them with finances or marketing or coaching or whatever it might be? How can we be a hub that provides resources and supports for them so they can focus on what God's called them to do? But I think the big thing is content and delivery in regards to training. Content's going to have to be somewhat different, but the delivery is going to have to be significantly different.
That's really helpful. And as someone who provides leadership to a denominational expression here, that idea of functioning as a hub is something that's been heavy on my heart since taking on this responsibility here in the last year, and trying to think through how do we function more like a resourcing hub versus a management organization.
Right.
So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that's helpful denominationally, but I think it's helpful for a church. As a church becomes a little bit more decentralized, to think about how can we be a resource hub for those smaller expressions of church out in the city or the community.
Right. So a local church can begin thinking through what it looks like for me to be a hub.
I think so. Yes. Yeah.
Are you seeing examples of that? I mean, you mentioned Mark's church earlier. Are there other examples that you might point to, say, hey, that's a good example where we could go and learn from?
Well, I think a really good place to start, and because you don't have to go, because there's not a whole lot to see. You'd have to be there at the right time, but is the underground. And I tell people all the time, the first thing I would do is just look at their website. They have a fantastic website. If you just Google Tampa Underground, their website is amazingly informative. I mean, it just tells who they are. There's all kinds of free resources on their website. But then the next thing I would do is probably go read. There's a book that Brian wrote just a year ago. He wanted to wait 10 years in just to make sure that he had something to write about. But he wrote one of the primary leaders, his name is Brian Sanders, and he wrote a book a year ago called Underground Church. And it's just the most practical, accessible, half of the book tells their story and half of it is just, here's how we do things. I mean, from governance to structure to fundraising. I mean, it's just super, super practical.
So he gets the governance issues in there.
Yes, it's all
fantastic.
Yeah,
that's one of my questions is, like, how do you provide structural governance in a hub like that? Yeah, that's great.
They do that. And then probably 3 months ago, he wrote another little book, and it's a small little book. It's just called Micro Churches. So it's just kind of like, in that book, he just defines why do they use the word microchurch and how do they define microchurch? Because I've noticed lately, it kind of seems like that word's getting a little bit, I don't know, people are just using it for other things and they're just slapping it on what was already existing and calling it a microchurch. And the underground, they're very intentional on why they use that language. So So I would start there. I think I just think of the micro, and it's not perfect, but they've been going at it now for about 12 years. And I've just never, ever met such a sacrificial, apostolic, prophetic group of people in my life. I mean, they move into the roughest parts of the city, and every time I'm around them, I'm just in awe of who they are and just how sacrificial they are for God's mission and just following Jesus into wherever he leads them. And again, I think they do have a bit of a kind of a proof of concept, because they've been doing it now for 12 years. So it's not, it's not just theory. They have lots of practical examples of what it looks like.
Thanks. What other questions are out there?
Brad, can I ask you a question institutionally? I know I hate to point this back to the central focus of a denominational mindset, but we have, I think, 2 or 3 DSs on this call right now. And what does the training of pastors look like to you down the road? Because, you send a guy through, 7-8 years of college and then seminary, and we have MDivs and DMins, and the actuality is, do they really know anything about marketing or about advertising or about how to actually walk into a neighborhood that they're not culturally similar to, and being able to reach the gospel? Because that's not the primary training we give in our colleges at this point in time. A lot of
that's a great
theology with a limited amount of that training, but you're talking about an entire focus change.
Yeah, so I think, and I'll just speak for my tribe, is most of our theological training couldn't be, I'll just say it like this, and hopefully no one from my tribe is listening in, but all of our seminaries, it is almost 100% Sunday centric. I mean, it's all about the Sunday gathering.
All about theology.
Yeah. Right. And so I actually think we're one of the implications of a move towards bivocational and co-vocational is we're going to have to rethink theological education. So, thank goodness there is more and more theological education options online. So you don't have to uproot, your life and family and move somewhere else and incur an enormous amount of debt and then go get a job that's not going to pay you enough to pay off that debt. But I would argue that the single best place for theological education to take place is in the local church. And there are more and more local churches that are doing that. And there's a few local churches that are actually partnering with our seminaries and providing education in the local church. So I just think one of the implications is we're going to have to rethink theological education. And I think having more and more theological education rooted in the local church is going to be a huge win. But then the other thing I would say is this whole conversation about vocation and co-vocation has to happen much earlier. So I would argue we ought to be having these conversations in youth groups, but without a doubt, we need to be having these conversations in collegiate ministries. So what I mean by that is we need college-age students to realize that for them to be really serious about ministry, they don't have to go to Bible college and seminary, that God can call them to be an engineer and plant a church at the same time. So I think we need to have more and more theological education that's coupled with skill training or business training, or, help them see, how can I align my primary calling in the marketplace with God's mission? Because typically, I didn't share this when we got started, I didn't become a believer till I was 30 years old. And up until that time, for 13 years, my brother and I were in the restaurant business together. And I remember when I became a believer, every single conversation I had with someone at church was that if I was serious about ministry, we needed to sell our secular business and I needed to go to seminary. Well, I tell you, when I hear that from someone nowadays, seriously, I want to just, first I want to scream. And then I want to say, listen, if you feel like God's called you to do that, don't leave it, stay. And then let's talk about how can you align that with God's mission? And I have more and more conversations about that all the time. I'll give you a beautiful example. Some of you are familiar with the Exponential Conference. I was doing a breakout on really bivocational and co-vocational at Expo. And the whole time I was talking, I noticed there was this guy, I still remember his name was James, sitting over here, and he was nodding his head. I mean, he was just really affirming everything that I said. It was almost embarrassing. And when I got finished with that little workshop, man, he made a beeline up to me. And instantly, as he opened his mouth, he started to weep. And he said, he like pointed his finger at me, and he started a business, and he's a believer. And he said, he was telling me about his business, and then he said, everyone was telling me I needed to sell my business. And then he said, I knew it was wrong. He said, I mean, I was just giving him like affirmation. He just knew that that he was supposed to stay there, and he was supposed to plant a church. But everyone was telling him, no, if you're serious about church planting, you need to sell that business. So I just think, and again, it's not for everybody, but I think we need to help, especially college students, understand how can they align what they feel like God's called them to do in the business world with church planting. So that's a long answer there, but I just think that it's going to have to shape and inform our theological education, to where our education isn't just theology. It could still be that, but we also, because we just have right now, we're kind of in in-between time. I'll tell you where my heart really breaks is there's a whole bunch of fully funded church planters that, it didn't take off the way they thought, or they're in a church that's on the decline and they have to become bivocational. And it's really hard for them to become bivocational because they have a whole lot of debt from seminary and they have no other skill. I mean, they'll say, look, I don't know how to do anything else other than just like, do church. So that's another whole piece, is like, how can we help pastors that are going to have to become bivo to think well about what kind of job might they do that would still align well with the ministry they're doing at the church. So yeah, it's gonna, if it isn't already an issue, the theological education piece, it's going to be, I think. And I don't think there's very many people that are like kind of on the forefront of that thinking. I know certainly not in my tribe. None of the seminaries are having these conversations around bivo covo. Anything else?
Yeah. What other questions?
One thing I just tell you, if this conversation interests you, a couple kind of follow-ups. About a year ago, I started a Facebook group, and it's just called Co-Vocational Church Planting. So if you're on Facebook, just search Co-Vocational Church Planting. Trust me, it's the only thing that will come up. And right now, there's well over 700 people that are in that group. So they're all just bivo-covo leaders. And, if you have a question or there's something that you're, struggling with, you just throw it out there and someone will jump in and say, hey, here's what I do, or here's what I've done. And then about a year ago, I wrote a book called Co-Vocational Church Planting, and it's a free ebook. It's in English and Spanish. And so once again, if you just Google Co-Vocational Church Planting ebook, it'll take you to a landing page where you can download that book for free in either English or Spanish. And it's about a 270, 280 page book. So there's quite a bit there, but this language about the benefits of bivo covo, but then also just like, what would this look like? If I was going to plant a church as a co-vocational church planter, what would be the steps and what are the things I need to consider? That's really what the whole book's about. So.
Brad, one of the things that you mentioned really early, in fact, your first word was the word simplification. And I want to come back to that for a second here. My background personally was in church planting for the first part of my ministry. And then I only pastored one established church, and that was my last 6 years. And it was a legacy church that was, had a ministry for everything, right? And it was a very complex organization. Someone asked me when I got there, what does it feel like? I'm like, it feels like unrolling a ball of twine that's all tangled together, and we're trying to sorting it out. That word simplification, I mean, it just rings my bell when it comes to a lot of established churches that are fairly complex. Are there good resources for helping a church to untangle itself? You mentioned clarifying the organizing principle of the church. Are there good resources that could help a church to do that? And then maybe even talk through the change process because that's hard adaptive leadership we're talking about there. To think through the change process that could be maybe a roadmap to that.
Yeah, so for me, those two things are connected in that I just think with existing congregations, and maybe this isn't true 100% of the time, but I've seen it be true in 90% of the time, is that I think in most existing congregations, we have to start with paradigm shifts. that I'm just convinced that if we've been church for a very long time, and in legacy kind of churches, this is the case, we have some deeply, deeply held assumptions about certain things that are probably wrong, that we may need to unlearn and relearn. And I mean really about the way we understand the nature and essence of the church, and mission, and discipleship, and evangelism, maybe even the gospel, leadership. There's all sorts of things. So if you're familiar, there's a guy in the business world, he uses a thing called the knowledge funnel. And it's kind of like, it's called business by design, but it's really about how we bring about change. And the words that he used, and I like to use different words, but the words, and some of you are probably familiar with this, he would use a funnel, and he would say, here's how we kind of come up with new ideas. It starts with what he calls mystery, and then it's what he calls heuristics, and then it's what he calls algorithms. Well, I changed that to 3 P words because I'm Baptist. They have to all begin with the same letter. You realize that, right? So for me, I think that funnel's a good way to think about change in an existing congregation, but here's my 3 P words. The first P word is paradigms. So in other words, again, I think we have some deeply held assumptions. I think most of the time it's the best place to start is help give time and space for people to rethink some things, and challenge them to say, hey, are there some things we need to unlearn and relearn about church and mission and discipleship? And then that leads to patterns. So I think there's several different kind of patterns of how do we start to bring those paradigm shifts into like the culture and their environment of the local church. And then the final P I'll usually use the word practice, or sometimes pilot. It's like, okay, now let's actually try something. Let's pilot something. Let's try some new practices that we've never, practiced before. And that in a sense becomes a pilot. So those 2 words can kind of go together. But I think in most cases, we have to change the way we think. We have to have some crucial paradigm shifts that take place before we can get. So for me, that's kind of, I don't know, it's almost like an adaptive change funnel. Yeah, maybe is a way to talk about it. And then back to the paradigm shifts. I think there's multiple paradigm shifts. I mean, I think there might be a dozen different paradigm shifts, but for me, the number one single most foundational and most important paradigm shift that I think changes everything else is what I just call the missionary nature of the church. So there's like this whole session that I'll do on the missionary nature of God and the missionary nature of the church. Is I want to help people rethink church. That most people think of church as a place where certain things happen, or even worse, most people today think of the church as a vendor of religious goods and services. So they think of the church, it exists for me to come and consume of religious goods and services. And I just think both of those are so jacked up that it messes with everything else about the church. So I'll usually, anytime I try to bring about change in existing congregation, is to spend some time to really talk about the true nature and essence of the church. And I think the best way for us to recognize the missionary nature of the church is to recognize the missionary nature of God. And the nature and essence of the church is rooted in the missionary nature of God. So in other words, if God is a missionary God, and he is, then we as his people are missionary people. So here's a way I'll say it a lot of times, is the church doesn't just send missionaries. The church is the missionary. So individually and collectively, we are a sent missionary people. Well, when people start to grapple with that, I mean, here's where the paradigm shift comes into play. Is I'm saying there ought to be a paradigm shift for every single one of us individually as we begin to see ourselves as missionaries. So the missionary isn't just the person we send to foreign fields, but I'm a missionary, you're a missionary, and God has sent you where you live, work, and play as a missionary. So I think there's a paradigm shift that will begin to happen for us individually, but then collectively there's a paradigm shift in the way we understand the nature and essence of the church. So we're not just a gathered, centralized entity, but we're a gathered and scattered entity. We're a called and sent people of God. And I just think most people, they don't think of themselves that way, for sure. I mean, if you say, hey, what's a missionary? They're not going to say me, right? They're going to say, oh, it's that paid professional over there. But they don't think of the church collectively that way either. And I just think when they really begin to have a paradigm shift around the missionary nature of the church, it changes everything else. It changes the way we think of discipleship. It changes the way we think about evangelism. It'll change the way we think about centralized versus decentralized. It just changes everything for me. It's just like the foundational paradigm shift as we start to think differently about the church. And then we start thinking, can you just see the implications of this? If we start thinking, hey, we're all missionaries, okay, then God's called me into the marketplace co-vocationally. And then I need, if I go in there as a missionary, then I need to think differently about work and what could I start there? They start thinking differently about their neighborhoods. And I just think it changes everything.
This is not the typical starting point. I'm curious. You said you came to faith in your early 30s. I mean, did you start with an paradigm that started with the missionary nature of God and that we operate missionally? Or how did you come to that realization?
Yeah. No, I didn't initially because I just listened to I just listened and thought like everyone told me to listen and think. Right. But it wasn't long. I just thought something doesn't add up. I just thought it just didn't make sense to me. And then it was just influences from other voices. I mean, very early on, I started reading Leslie Newbegin, the Gospel in Our Culture Network. Really, I'll make this a really short story, Dale, but I remember very, very, very early on going to a church planting boot camp. It was a week-long boot camp. And this was a part of my tribe. They didn't have any other training at that point. I mean, this was 20 years ago. And they brought in 3 speakers. And the first speaker was Ed Stetzer. So back then, no one knew who Ed Stetzer was. I mean, it was 20 years ago. The next one was a guy named Dieter Zander, who worked at Willow Creek. He's the one that started the Access Ministry, back then, what do we call them? I mean, it was
like 20-somethings at the time.
Yeah, exactly. They were 20-somethings. And then there was a lady from San Francisco named Linda Berkowitz. Well, I tell you, Ed and Dieter pretty much said the exact same thing, but they used different language because Ed was a boomer and Dieter, like you said, was 20-something. It was all attractional model, do your marketing, blah, 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 blah. Well, at the end of the week, they gave Linda one day and she started speaking about church planting I'd never heard anyone talk about church planting like she did. And I still remember when it was over. Now we're very good friends. When it was over, I went up to her and I just said, Linda, I said, you're talking about church planting like I've never heard before. I mean, it's like, where do I get this stuff? I mean, like, what should I go read? And she said, I still remember this. I mean, this is 20 years ago. She said, go read anything from a guy named Daryl Guter. And I still remember going, how do you spell Guter? That's a weird name. And then she said, go search on the internet, anything written by this group called the Gospel in Our Culture Network. Well, even that, I thought, that's a weird name. What is that? Gospel in Our Culture Network. Well, if you know anything about the Gospel in Our Culture Network, it was a kind of a missiological group that was started because of the influence of Leslie Newbegin. And that's what started it. I mean, I just went and started reading that stuff. And as I started reading that stuff 20 years ago, I was just thinking, no, this is right. I mean, this is the way we need to start with mission, not with church. And then eventually influences from people like Mike Frost and Alan Hirsch. And I just think it just not only does it make sense, I just know it's right. And because I'll tell you, here's a little example I'll share sometimes that I'll say, if we sent any of us on this call right now, if we said, we're sending you to Pakistan tomorrow and we want you to plant a church, never in a million years would we think we need to go find a place to rent, find a worship pastor, buy a sound system and send out flyers, right? I mean, no, we would instantly say, okay, I need to be a missionary. I need to learn the culture. I need to build relationships. I need to get engaged in evangelism and discipleship. And I just think we are in an increasing missionary context and we have to think more like missionaries. Now, again, I know none of us live in Pakistan, but most people don't realize just how unchurched, de-churched, and lost our culture is because we live in a Christian bubble. And most pastors just hang out with Christians for the most part. And I knew better than that because, I had no Christian influence until I was 30 years old. So I knew, and I still know what it's like. So I just think, so I would just encourage you to, really the last decade, there's so many good voices and resources to listen into. So just where we start.
The role of shared learning having transitioned a church to a more missional ecclesiology, the role of shared learning with our congregation, with our key leaders in the church, and then moving it outward from there, I think might have been the most critical piece of that. And so I love that you're pointing to written resources that could be used in a shared learning environment, that catalyst that can happen in us, it can happen in our team as well,
Right.
as we engage in shared learning and don't kind of present ourselves as the expert, but we read that alongside of them and discuss it together. Man, the Holy Spirit uses that powerfully in his church. So
yeah, and that's why the very first resource we ever did was Missional Essentials, because it was just for small groups. I still think the best place for this to kind of catch on is in our small groups, where people are reading and dialoguing and conversing together, and with, like you say, with the Spirit's leading. It's, this isn't some kind of top-down sort of thing, but it's more of a grassroots focus on the innovators and early adopters, the people that are already doing this and people that know this is right, and encourage and resource them, and then tell their stories back into the rest of the congregation. It's just you can't preach a 6-week sermon series and think everyone's going to get it. It's just, those deeply held assumptions are so deeply held. It never works that way.
Yeah, you don't shift paradigms, man. That's it. You don't shift a paradigm from the platform.
No,
it has to happen across the table in a discussion.
I think it happens. That's right. And it happens by telling stories. It happens by shaping language. It happens by changing scorecards of what we count and measure. Yeah. It's it's that cultural adaptive change rather than, the top down, organizational change. So,
yeah.
Well, I feel like I've talked way too much. I hope.
Well, that's what I was looking for. I was looking for that, because we learn from people's stories, and I think that we can learn a ton from your story, and I appreciate you taking time to walk us through that a little bit, because that's one of the most catalytic parts even of what we heard today. We can talk concepts, but when it gets lived out in flesh, we get a picture of what it looks like. And I think you gave us that. And not that it all wasn't good, but I think you gave us a picture in that last couple of minutes there.
Well, and I would just encourage you to go download the Kovo book. And then also, if you're interested, there's about 80% of this is in the Kovo book, but there's another little free ebook that I wrote this last year. It's just called Rethink, and it's subtitled 9 Paradigm Shifts for Activating the Church. So it's a very, very simple, very accessible, about 100-page ebook that just covers 9 of those paradigm shifts. And really, each of the little lessons in that ebook, they're really concise. It's just kind of like, you'll see, it's just kind of like an introduction to each of those topics. So for example, the very first one is on the missionary nature of God in the church. So once again, if you just Googled Rethink ebook, it'll take you to a landing page where you can download that in either English or Spanish.
I love that you've got Spanish versions of 2 of these resources that you've mentioned today. About almost 35% of our churches are Spanish. So that's a huge help to us. Thank you.
Good.
Well, I want to say thanks for your time today. I want to respect our hour that we kind of planned here. People can follow you online too, right? You're on a number of social media platforms, and you blog as well.
Yeah, so I do a lot on Facebook and Twitter, but then also I have a blog that's just missionalchurchnetwork.com that I try to blog pretty regularly.
Awesome. Well, I would just commend Brad's work to you. I think he's one of the best missiologists we have in North America. You can learn a ton from him, and really thankful for you dropping in and spending an hour with us today, brother. And I so long to get you in front of our full delegation. We'd have had 600-700 people there for that gathering, and this is such an important conversation for us to have. I hope that maybe someday I might be able to get you back in front of that group.
Oh yeah, we can make it work. And hey, we're all in Florida together, right?